Here's a question nobody asks about Nikola Tesla. Not, did he invent the radio? Not, did Edison steal from him? Not even, was he really crazy? The question nobody asks is this: why did one of the most brilliant human beings who ever lived die alone, in debt, in a New York hotel room, feeding pigeons because they were his only friends? Because that's not a story about bad luck. That's not a story about a corrupt system destroying a good man. That is a story about a mind so extraordinary that it became its own prison. And today, we're going to go inside that prison, because what happened to Nikola Tesla is one of the most important psychological case studies in the history of human ambition. And if you've ever been told you're too much, if you've ever been the smartest person in the room and still somehow lost, you need to hear this. Let's establish something first. Nikola Tesla was not just smart. He was operating on a completely different level than almost everyone around him. The man could memorize entire books. He could perform complex calculus in his head. He spoke 8 languages fluently. He could visualize mechanical systems in 3 dimensions with such precision that he claimed he never needed to build a physical prototype. He would run the machine in his mind, let it operate for weeks, and then check it for wear. Let that land. He ran machines in his head for weeks and checked them for wear. His professor at the Graz University of Technology once wrote a letter to Tesla's father warning him that his son was a man of unusual gifts, but that he was so consumed by study, so obsessive, that the professor feared the young Tesla would kill himself with work. Tesla was 10 years old at the time. And here's where the story gets complicated, because every single trait that made Tesla extraordinary, every single one, also contained the seed of his destruction. That's not a coincidence. That's the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Tesla's ability to visualize was genuinely unprecedented. Neurologists today who study his accounts believe he may have had what's called eidetic imagery at a level that is essentially uncharted in documented human history. When he was a child, this gift came with a curse. He would see visions, vivid, overwhelming, involuntary flashes of light and imagery that would appear without warning. He described seeing rivers of fire when he closed his eyes, entire scenes playing out in front of him with the same clarity as the physical world. His mother, recognizing that her son experienced reality differently, told him, "Those are gifts." And they were. They absolutely were. But here's what that gift also meant in practice. Tesla became addicted to the internal world. Why negotiate with messy, slow, expensive physical reality when you could just think the thing into perfect existence inside your own mind? And this right here is the first way Tesla's mind worked against him, because the real world doesn't care how perfect your internal prototype is. Investors don't fund visions. Partners can't collaborate with a process they can't see. And when you're so confident in your mental model that you skip external validation, you skip the feedback loop that catches your errors. Tesla once spent years developing his dynamic theory of gravity, a theory he was certain would revolutionize physics, the way his AC system had revolutionized electrical engineering. He told reporters it was nearly complete. He described it as his crowning achievement. He never published it. No completed manuscript was ever found. The most brilliant mind of his era may have spent years working on something that existed only in his head. That's not a tragedy of circumstance. That's a tragedy of psychology. Now I want to talk about something people almost never discuss when they talk about Tesla. His pride, not arrogance in the cheap braggart sense. Something more complex and more dangerous than that. Tesla had what I'd call a pride architecture, a deeply constructed self-image built around the belief that his mind was the asset, and that compromising his vision was the same as destroying himself. When he was working for Thomas Edison in 1884, Edison offered him $50,000, the equivalent of well over $1 million today, to improve the efficiency of his DC motors. Tesla worked on the problem obsessively for months, solved it, and came back to Edison expecting payment. Edison laughed, told Tesla he didn't understand American humor. The offer, apparently, had been a joke. Tesla quit immediately. Now, most people tell this story as evidence of Edison's villainy, and Edison was honestly not a great person in that moment. But let's think about this differently. Tesla, newly arrived in America, essentially broke, with no professional network and no real financial safety net, walked away from $50,000 because he felt dishonored. Was he right to feel dishonored? Absolutely. Was walking away the strategically intelligent move for his long-term mission? That's a much harder question, because here's what happened next. Tesla spent the following months doing manual labor, digging ditches, while his mind was full of alternating current systems that would eventually power the modern world. He was so committed to his pride architecture that he would rather dig ditches than compromise on principle. And look, I'm not here to tell you that was wrong. There's something genuinely noble about it. But nobility doesn't pay for laboratory equipment, and it doesn't keep the lights on when you're trying to build the future. This is the part of the Tesla story that should be studied in every business school on Earth, because it is simultaneously his most heroic act and one of the clearest demonstrations of how his psychology undermined his mission. By the early 1890s, Tesla and George Westinghouse had won the war of currents. Their AC system had defeated Edison's DC. They had illuminated the 1,893 World's Fair 100,000 light bulbs powered by Tesla's system. They were building the generators at Niagara Falls that would electrify the northeastern United States. Tesla had done it. He had genuinely changed the world, but Westinghouse was in financial trouble. The patent royalties he owed Tesla, based on their original agreement, were becoming a significant liability. Westinghouse came to Tesla and explained the situation, said the company might not survive if Tesla held them to the contract. Tesla took his contract, put it on Westinghouse's desk, and tore it up. He tore it up. He walked away from what historians estimate would have been the equivalent of hundreds of millions, possibly billions, of dollars in today's money, and his reason was genuinely moving. He said Westinghouse had believed in him when nobody else did. He wouldn't let a man who trusted him go down for it. That is a beautiful human moment. I genuinely mean that. But here's the part nobody talks about. Tesla needed that money. He needed it to fund the Wardenclyffe Tower, his dream of a global wireless energy transmission system. He needed it to run a laboratory. He needed it to protect his patents. He needed it to maintain the institutional independence that would allow him to keep inventing without compromise. By tearing up that contract, Tesla didn't just decline wealth. He defunded his own future. Within 15 years, he was struggling to find investors. Within 20, he was moving between hotels, running up debts he couldn't pay. Within 30, he was alone, feeding pigeons on a park bench, a figure of public curiosity and private tragedy. He gave away the mechanism of his own survival because his internal value system, loyalty, is more important than leverage, was stronger than his strategic self-interest. And the question you have to sit with is this: was that virtue or was that self-destruction? I think it was both. At the same time, let's talk about how Tesla actually worked, because it's important context for everything that comes next. Tesla was, by every account, a man of extreme obsessive focus. When a problem captured him, it consumed him. He would work for days with minimal sleep. He would fixate on a single system or concept to the exclusion of almost everything else: relationships, finances, basic self-care. This is a mode of cognition that modern psychology associates with what some researchers call hyperfocus, a state common in people with certain neurological profiles where attention becomes so concentrated on one thing that everything peripheral essentially ceases to exist. For a creative genius working alone in a laboratory, this is a superpower. For a human being who needs to manage money, maintain partnerships, navigate politics, and build institutional infrastructure, it is genuinely debilitating. Tesla would become so absorbed in a project that he would simply not deal with anything else. Correspondence piled up, business negotiations were ignored, patent filings were delayed, investors who needed updates to maintain confidence received nothing. J.P. Morgan, who funded Wardenclyffe Tower, eventually cut off Tesla's funding, not only because the project's commercial viability was unclear, but because Tesla had a pattern of disappearing into his work and failing to maintain the communication that investors required to stay confident. Tesla saw this as Morgan failing to understand the magnitude of the vision. Morgan saw it as Tesla being an unreliable business partner, and in the cold language of how institutions actually function, Morgan wasn't wrong. Here's the thing about all of these patterns: the pride, the obsession, the internal world, the refusal to compromise, they all share a common root. Tesla fundamentally believed that the quality of his ideas was the only currency that should matter, that if the idea was brilliant enough, the world would reorganize itself around it, that he shouldn't have to sell anything. He shouldn't have to manage anyone. He shouldn't have to build coalitions or give progress reports or make his vision legible to minds less capable than his. He was, in the deepest sense, allergic to the performance of the mundane. And this is where we have to be honest about something uncomfortable. The world doesn't run on ideas. It runs on systems, and systems require maintenance, communication, relationship management, and political navigation, none of which are glamorous, none of which feel like real work to a mind like Tesla's, and all of which are absolutely essential to turning a vision into a reality that survives. Edison understood this. Edison was, by most accounts, a significantly less gifted inventor than Tesla, but Edison was a genius of systems. He built laboratories with teams. He managed investors with showmanship. He was relentless in commercializing, patenting, and protecting his work. He understood that a good enough idea, perfectly executed and ruthlessly defended, beats a perfect idea poorly managed every single time. Tesla found this worldview almost incomprehensible. He once described Edison's method as inefficient in the extreme, and he wasn't wrong technically. But Edison won, not because he was smarter, because he understood the game. Tesla refused to play the game, and refusing to play doesn't mean you escape it. It just means you lose by default. Now, I want to push back on myself, because this video is not a takedown. Tesla was right about things that the entire world told him he was wrong about. AC current, radio transmission, the wireless transfer of energy, resonance-based systems, the possibility of a global communication network. He was right, repeatedly, profoundly right. And the lesson most people draw from Tesla is simple. Visionaries get ignored, but I think the real lesson is harder than that. The real lesson is this: being right is not sufficient. Being right is the entry fee. It's the minimum requirement. After that, you have to build. You have to maintain. You have to communicate. You have to stay in the game long enough for your rightness to manifest as reality. Tesla left the game early, repeatedly, by choice. And the tragedy is not that the world failed him, though in many ways it did. The tragedy is that Tesla failed Tesla, not through weakness, through an excess of his own extraordinary nature. In his final years, Tesla lived in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker. He had essentially no money. He owed debts to the hotel. He was estranged from most of the scientific community. He gave occasional interviews to journalists who treated him as a curiosity, the eccentric old inventor with his wild theories about death rays and extraterrestrial signals. He fed pigeons in Bryant Park. He had, by his own description, fallen in love with one particular pigeon, a white female with light gray tips on her wings. He described her as the great love of his life. Pause. Let me sit with that for a moment, because it deserves the respect of silence. A man who had illuminated the world. A man whose mind had generated systems that still underpin modern civilization. A man who had genuinely, concretely made human life better for billions of people. Found his deepest connection in the final chapter of his life, with a bird. Because the human world, with all its compromise and politics and mundane performance, had been too much, had asked too much of him, had required him to be something he constitutionally could not be. And so he retreated to a pigeon, to a small room, to a mind still full of visions that would die with him. He died on January 7th, 1943, alone. The maid found him 2 days later. He was 86 years old. So what do we do with this? Because I don't want to leave you with just a tragedy. A tragedy without application is just entertainment. Here's what I take from Tesla's life. First, your greatest strength and your greatest weakness are usually the same thing. Tesla's visualization, his intensity, his pride, these were not separate from his genius. They were his genius. You cannot separate them. Which means self-knowledge is not just nice to have. It is a survival skill. You need to know what your nature costs you, even as you celebrate what it creates. Second, the world does not automatically recognize value. It recognizes demonstrated, communicated, institutionally embedded value. If you are not willing to do the work of making your value legible to others, you will be brilliant and invisible. And brilliant and invisible doesn't change anything. Third, leverage is not selling out. Tesla tearing up that Westinghouse contract felt, to him, like integrity. But integrity in service of your mission sometimes means preserving the resources you need to complete that mission. Giving away your leverage because it feels noble in the moment can be the most self-destructive thing you ever do. And finally, the people we call visionaries were also just people with psychological patterns, with blind spots, with wounds that shaped their choices in ways they couldn't always see. Tesla was not a god who got betrayed. He was an extraordinary human being whose extraordinary mind in all its gifts and all its limitations ultimately constrained him as much as the world ever did. That's the story worth telling. Not because it diminishes him, because it makes him real. And real is what we can actually learn from. If this video made you think differently about Tesla or about how we think about genius in general, share it with someone who would appreciate it. These are the conversations I think we actually need to be having. And if you want to go deeper on the psychology of how extraordinary minds navigate ordinary systems, I'll link a few videos in the description that connect directly to what we talked about today. Tesla didn't fail because the world was too small for him. He failed because he never learned to build a bridge between his world and ours. Don't make the same mistake. I'll see you in the next one.